I'm Bryce Nelson. I'm Professor of Journalism here at Annenberg, and I'd like to welcome you to our How Journalists Work series. We have a wonderful bonus. Farai today could not come because she had to go off on a flight, but we're more than honored to have us have Nicole Childers, who's her boss at NPR. She became her, now those of you who know Farai, know she's not very old, but Nicole became her boss at 28, when Nicole was 28. So that's, and also Nicole started out as the intern for Farai, so she went from being intern to boss in a relatively few years. So what that proves is that you should be nice to everybody that works for you. Never know what will happen in life. Nicole is from San Diego. She went to Penn. She's an Emmy Award-winning journalist. She's going to tell you something about her career, but she began her journalism career as an intern for Diane Sawyer's staff, Primetime Live at ABC News. She joined ABC News in '99 and went to serve as associate producer for World News Tonight with Peter Jennings, where she covered major stories ranging from the attacks of September 11th, which you can ask her about, to the war in Iraq and death of Pope John Paul II. She's received numerous awards for her contributions, including 2 Emmys, Peabody, and DuPont, 2 Edward R. Murrow Awards. In the summer of 2004, she served as a producer for the launch of ABC News digital channel, ABC News Now. And she was a member of the ABC News Diversity Committee and served as a board member for popandpolitics.com, which Farai was one of the founders of, which is now associated with the Annenberg School. One thing before I forget, I want you all to come to lunch and Judy Muller coming in. That's good. I want you all to come to lunch in 2 weeks on October the 3rd, right here in this room, and we're going to have Mark Brown and Michelle Tuzzi, who are both co-anchors on KABC News. I think they do 3 newscasts a day, and they're both graduates of the Annenberg School of Journalism. Farai just got her assignment yesterday, and so she had to, but she said that she was more than adequately represented by Nicole, which she is. And we're really glad that Nicole could come on such short notice, and not a lot of people wouldn't do that on this short notice. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. I wanted to first just thank everybody for coming. I know that Farai definitely sends her regrets. She had to, as Bryce mentioned, get on a flight at around 1, so she was unable to make it. But what I think that I'm first going to do is just going to give you guys an idea of my path through the journalism world.
I forgot to put in her current assignment, which is executive producer of News and Notes for NPR, a great place for employment these days in public radio, and she became senior supervising producer of the program in July of 2005. So she's Farai's boss, and she works for Sidney Kennard, who's been associated with the school. So, okay.
So as I was saying, I just want to start off and give you guys an idea of the path from intern to where I am now, and just hopefully interspersed in there, I'll add a little bit of just kind of my impressions of the industry, and then I want to kind of open it up to you guys because I really want this to be more of a conversation. I want to hear what's on your guys, what's on your minds and what you guys are most interested in. As Bryce mentioned, I'm a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania, and even from the very beginning, I took kind of a different path into journalism. I really struggled while I was there and deciding on a major, and I felt the pressure to become a communications major, and I actually decided instead to become an African American Studies major. To which, several people said, well, what are you going to do with that? And how is that going to get you to your ultimate goal? And really what I ended up doing was a lot of my concentration within the African American Studies program was on media and minority representation in the media. So that was one way where I was able to kind of mold my 2 interests and my 2 passions. In my senior year, it was very difficult for a while. I definitely wanted to be a professor, and I said, well, which do I choose, the media or to become a professor? And I said, well, the professor is something that I can always come back to, and I can always come back and go to graduate school, but the media bug and the passion that I had for news just I knew I had to get it out of my system, and it's still not out of my system. My first internship was with the local CBS affiliate in Philadelphia, working with KYW, and in that capacity, I worked both on the TV news side and on the radio side. On the radio side, writing press releases, and overall, I got a taste of both worlds, and I knew, I was like, TV, that's what I want to do. The way that I met Farai, which is an interesting story in and of itself that I was telling Bryce a bit earlier. It was before I had declared my major in my sophomore year at Penn. I was in San Diego over the summer for the Republican National Convention. And I was walking around. That was really the first time that I said, wow, this is what I want to do. Because it's the Republican National Convention, media outlets everywhere. And I just knew this is it. And there weren't very many African Americans at the Republican National Convention. And I spotted one of the few, Farai, and she was walking around. She had at the time she was working with CNN, and she had her CNN lanyard around her neck, and she was going around. I was watching her going around interviewing people, and she came up to me because I was there with a nonpartisan youth organization. So she came up to me to interview me, and I started interviewing her, asking her how she got into journalism, and she finally just said, here's my card, keep in touch with me. And I did, and she and I established a mentor-mentee relationship over email, and by the time, and I definitely kept in contact with her, and by the time I reached my junior year, I knew, this was after my CBS internship, I knew, and I said to her, this is what I want to do. And at the time, she had just started at ABC, and she said, well, how do you feel about, having an internship at ABC News? And I said, oh, it'd be a dream come true. And so she was able to kind of link me up with Diane Sawyer, and so that summer between my junior and senior year, I was an intern for ABC News for Diane Sawyer's unit at Primetime Live. And that was just definitely a magical summer because I learned so much about the industry. I learned so much from Diane. I was able to go undercover for a story, which was very, very exciting to me. And I just knew that that's what I wanted to do. So after graduation, I packed up my stuff and moved to New York and started, as a desk assistant. So I worked on the national desk at ABC and just kind of worked just about every shift imaginable, day or night, until I finally settled in at World News Tonight as a desk assistant, and then kind of worked my way through the World News Tonight system. I was a desk assistant, then I was in research, and then I was a PA and tape, and then an associate producer. And along the way, covered quite a few different stories. As was mentioned, was there in New York during 9/11 when that happened. Also the Pope, and just a lot of different stories. I also had the opportunity, for a while I was with the business unit, so I got the opportunity to go out on the road quite a few times to cover different stories. And then about a year ago, I was approached by NPR or actually I should back up a little bit. One of the last kind of projects that I was working on at ABC was I was brought on board to help launch ABC News Now. And that was definitely an interesting experience because we had about 3 weeks to put it all together right before the elections, as Judy probably remembers. And so it was definitely because Peter wanted to do gavel-to-gavel coverage of the conventions. And so I was doing everything from assembling staff to coordinating, how are we going to do this, how are we going to put on a 24-hour broadcast, with Peter doing gavel-to-gavel coverage. And so it was definitely a challenge. And the interesting thing for me was that it was also my first experience in really just doing cross-promotional stuff, that we were not just doing stuff that would appear on World News Tonight, but we were also looking at, okay, we have this now 24-hour channel that we're having to program for, and how do we fill all those gaps? Obviously, given our resources, we're going to have to play things more than one time. Are we going to do extended versions? And then the other part of that was the web, that we were offering some of what we were playing on ABC News Now to subscribers so that they could log on and do that. So it was quite a bit of it was definitely baptism by fire, but an excellent learning experience in terms of, realizing that the future is in the technology, and that the future is that it's not enough to just have it on TV or on the radio. And World News Tonight at that point they had, Peter was doing a daily note to viewers. And so I think that increasingly, and now my understanding is that they have a webcast, that ABC News has a webcast specifically for internet. I guess you can't really say viewers, but yeah, I guess internet viewers. They view it on the web and on the phone. Exactly. And so about a little over a year ago, I was approached by NPR to come join the team of at the time it was News and Notes with Ed Gordon, and I really struggled because I definitely love TV. I love the visual image. That's what made me choose TV, is knowing that you can have two scripts, and depending on what visual images you put over it, you can tell two different stories. And so it was definitely a struggle for me to change mediums, but I knew that it would be a wonderful opportunity to serve in the capacity as a manager. And so I said, hey, you only live once, let me go for it. And I'm glad that I did, because I've definitely learned to appreciate radio. Instead of putting together 2.5, 3-minute packages in TV, I'm now able to work on 13-minute pieces. And it's much easier to get those pieces together because I don't have to worry about sending a camera crew to somebody's home and finding a camera crew to go to somebody's home. We can do it all over the phone. We can either get that person into a studio, or sometimes, depending on the story, we're able to just say, hey, we'll call you back from the studio, and it's instantly done. So I've definitely grown to appreciate that. I love writing, and I love great writing. And you have some of the best writing in radio. And it's had me appreciating just sound a lot more than I did, especially as someone who fell in love with the visual image. Learning how to work with sound and learning how to listen for sound and learning the nuances in people's voices and how there's really power in that. And so I've been at NPR around 14 months. As Bryce mentioned, now I'm the executive producer of the show, and we're kind of at an interesting place right now because we just named Farai Chideya as the host of our show, and in 6 months we're going to be relaunching News and Notes to include a larger multimedia component. And that will be interesting. Those of you who know Farai know that she's very good at multimedia. She's had her website for quite some time, Pop in Politics. So it'll really be an interesting venture in that we will be looking and seeking for more interactivity between us and the audience. I mean, right now, we already are always doing, web build-outs. If we're doing a story, like we just recently did a story on Tupac and talked to Tupac's mother, Afeni Shakur. And for the website, made sure to do a bigger web build-out and add components on the website that you didn't hear by listening to the radio. And that's like one of those things that you get, hey, let's get people to the site by saying at the end of a piece, if you want to hear more of this interview, log on to our website. And I think that the new show will be it'll build more on that kind of cross-promotional things, that on the air we'll be sending people more frequently to our website for more content. What's that content going to be? We're still figuring it out, but I think it's safe to assume that a lot of it will be stuff like message boards and finding ways, asking our listeners for their input, asking them to participate in contributing ideas. Or it might be one of the things that I think was very effective at ABC News is that when I was with the business unit, if we knew we were working on a story on mortgage prices, or we would send out an email to all of the ABC News subscribers saying, hey, are you looking to buy a home? Are you able to afford it? What are your concerns? And we would get hundreds, literally hundreds and hundreds of emails from people. And a lot of times that's how we found our folks to interview, was people were writing in with their compelling stories. And sometimes it kind of made us change what we thought our focus in the story was going to be. So I think that that's a lot of what you'll see in the new News and Notes, is that kind of stuff, like us finding ways and really trying to be creative about how can we engage our listeners, how can we engage them in a way where they'll be more a part of the process and kind of reeled in. So I'm really excited about that. And now I think I do want to open it up and hear what's on your minds and hear what you guys want to talk about.
We will end the session promptly at 1, like we end all these sessions, but Nicole said that she will stay around and answer your question individually if you want.
Yep.
See, we had a question over there.
I was just wondering, besides the transition from television to radio, did you find that there was a difference from working from like a commercial news organization like ABC News to doing NPR, which is sort of an extension, like a nonprofit sort?
Well, as some of you may have heard, I mean, the growth right now is in public radio. And more jobs, definitely. In terms of resources, I think that the biggest thing that I recognized was, as I said, the opportunities to really do the kinds of stories that I wasn't able to do at ABC News, and also knowing that a lot of the coverage at ABC News, you had to rely on pool feeds, so the opportunities as a producer to go out in the field were severely limited. Because you had to justify, okay, why should ABC spend the money on a $400 plane ticket to send me to Colorado or wherever the story was and hire a camera crew when CNN or Fox or whoever already had a camera set up and got all the video for us? Whereas I feel like in radio, our show, for example, we sent Farai down to Hurricane Katrina. She's been down to New Orleans 3 times. I was with our former host, Ed Gordon. We went down to Montgomery, Alabama for about 4 or 5 days to report on the 50th anniversary of the bus boycott. We went down with there were probably about 4 of us who went down to Montgomery, Alabama, and Farai was among them. And so I think that definitely I have seen that in terms of resources that there are more resources and really able to do more. But I think it's because of those 2 things. I don't think that you can fairly really separate them. I think in part it's the medium, and in part it is because public radio, there is definitely some growth. And I think in terms of the growth too, it's really enabled public radio to think outside of the box when it comes to being creative. I think that's why a News and Notes is possible, and why, especially as we're looking forward to an increased use of technology and being creative, I think that the extra resources definitely help to achieve that.
But do you think that it's also because public radio has this sort of more of a mission to serve the community, or being like a public, supported in part by public money, that you have like more freedom in terms of there's less sort of commercial pressures on you to do the kind of stories that you want?
I think yes and no. I think that what has surprised me about radio is that, I was very used to kind of the ABC News, World News Tonight model, where it was decided what we were going to cover and how we were going to cover it, and that was it. Whereas and the affiliates, they really didn't have much of a choice. They had to take the show at either 6 or 6:30. That's what they were doing. Whereas in public radio, there is a lot more interaction, because my show, for example, is carried in 88 stations across the country. But those stations can choose to pick us up and drop us at any time. They have complete control over that. They choose when they're going to put us on the air. So there is definitely a different set of in terms of accountability in public radio than there is. I think that overall, yes, I do think that you have this kind of preconceived notion that it's public radio, so that means that we're going to do the best and the best. But I think that just the normal, I think that when I sit down in my editorial meeting and we're deciding what stories to do, we're doing what stories we think are most important. We do stories that we think are most powerful and engaging. That's really what runs us.
What major markets are you in, and how does your focus differ from day to day? What's your mission versus day to day?
Our mission is we're geared towards an African American audience. So we do not cover breaking news in a traditional way, which was something that I, after working for World News Tonight for so long, definitely had to get used to. So for example, when I was saying earlier that we did something last week on Tupac Shakur, at the beginning of our show, it's a 1-hour show. We have a 12-minute segment just immediately. And that whole 12-minute segment we dedicated last Wednesday to Tupac. And we started out with a reporter's piece from Josh Levs out in Atlanta, and he went to go visit the Tupac Amaru Center. And then out of that, we had the interview with Afeni Shakur. So daily, we try to kind of use as a guide, what are African Americans talking about? What are African American listeners? What do they want to hear? And sometimes it's not always veering away from the top story of the day. If something's going on in Iraq, I have always made the argument, hey, when you look at the disproportionate number of minorities in the military, it's something that black people are paying attention to. And so it's more covering the main stories, but finding an angle that's different from what you would see and the kinds of coverage you would see in your mainstream outlets. Finding experts who are either African American, or really it's not always the experts, it's the angles. And when I believe I was on board for a few months, and one of the things that I wanted to do was looking at just Islam and just the number of black Muslims around the country, and how they were affected by the war on terror. And so just really finding the different angles that we're able to do that are geared a little bit more specifically to an African American audience. And day to day, they're more on the lines of the traditional, following breaking news as it happens. Yes.
Do you see yourself going back to television? Is that something interesting?
I've definitely considered it because I still definitely have that passion for the visual image. And every time I'm watching CNN, there are definitely things that I missed. Radio is definitely, I would say, a lot more laid back. And I don't feel, at least at NPR, I don't feel that same kind of adrenaline rush. Part of it might be just because of the show that I'm on. But overall, I mean, there's nothing more powerful to me than, as I said before, marrying that visual image with the script and knowing that the choices you make in both are really telling the story. So I could definitely see myself at some point returning to TV. Yes, I have time.
Question over here.
Yeah, going back to your work on ABC News Now.
Yes.
ABC has News Now, NBC, the local at least, has News Raw. I just want to know your comments based on your work for it, where you think the future of online broadcast production is going to be, if there is a viewership, and how it's going to take place.
I mean, I think that it's already, you look at and I know that I'm veering slightly off the trail here with this, but you look at just the popularity of YouTube and how people have just really grasped onto the idea that, there's video that they can, send in a link and you can watch it whenever you want. And I think that that's really, when you look at even beyond TV news, I think that definitely, I know when I was at World News Tonight, a lot of what we talked about is it still important to have it at 6:30 or 6 o'clock? Are people even home then? And I think having these digital channels that allow ABC to have 3 different channels that are 24 hours, what that allows you to do is that allows you to, for ABC News Now, I haven't watched their programming recently, but initially they were playing World News Tonight 3, 4, 5 times a day, as late as 1, 2 o'clock in the morning. No, go ahead.
It's a conversation.
In LA, I was saying newsroom here, we always had News Now on, so I saw it, whereas most people don't. But I had a Nightline piece that would be run maybe 3 different times because they got 24 hours to fill. And by the way, next Thursday, ABC News Now is going to run one of our pieces from News 21.
USC students, right?
Yes, in the long form. It's supposed to go in Good Morning America. They got it on a shelf, and they cut it down to 3 minutes, as you can imagine. On ABC News Now, it's going to run the full 8 minutes. So, and that's our students from here. So when something's new like this technology's new, and because they don't have a lot of viewers, you can get in there. They've got young anchors, they've got young reporters, and it's a very exciting place to get in on the ground floor. Just thought I'd throw that out.
And I think that the other part of it too is that when you mentioned that they ran the full 8 minutes, that's another thing. When you look at a show or a broadcast, Peter always wanted it to be called a broadcast and not a show. Don't dare say a show; it's a broadcast. I can say it now. You never know. No, I'm just teasing. When you look at a broadcast like World News Tonight, that's really, when you take out all the commercials, 22 minutes, that really limits that. That's why you have 2.5, 3 minute pieces, sometimes 4 if you're really, really lucky and it's a big feature. But if you're Peter, right, or doing Person of the Week. But really, when you do put it online or create some kind of on-demand service, it leaves you a lot more flexibility. You don't have to stick to that 22-minute format, which means you can run a piece for 8 minutes. And when you're still putting together that 22-minute broadcast, you can say, okay, we're going to do the 2.5. You just saw the 2.5 minutes. go to our website to see a fuller version of that. But I do think that that's the future, because people and consumers are showing pretty regularly that that's what they want. They want to be able to listen to a story or watch a story when they want to watch it, and that's the joy of on demand, is that they're able to do so. And so I think that that's going to continue to be a growing market. I think that what we're already seeing is that all media outlets are having to at least start talking about that and start considering, okay, how are we going to capitalize it? And it's not just it's not just with the news business. I mean, when you think about DVD sales, and you think about how consumers, when they want something, they want something. So sometimes you'll have a movie come out, and within a month, 2 months, if not sooner, the DVD is already out. And that's a way that the movie companies are making their money back, is they're saying, hey, maybe it's not in the actual movie theaters where we're going to make our money. Maybe now it's through DVD sales at $20, a DVD. So I think that all kinds of, it's across the board with all of the technology that's out there. Consumers are saying, I want it, and I want it now. And I think that's why you see even on cable stations, with their on-demand services for HBO and their shows. So like I said, I think it's completely across the board, and news isn't any different.
Andrew has a right question.
I have a two-part question. What was the journalistic difference between covering Tupac's death in broadcast versus radio, and who do you think killed him?
I have no idea who killed him. The journalistic difference between covering him, you mean radio versus TV? I think that part of it has to do with, if I think of kind of a longer form, like if a prime time or a 2020 or a Dateline would cover, because I think that's probably a more comparable or a more appropriate comparison. I think that obviously with a TV you would get the visual image of the Tupac Center, which we obviously did not have. But I think in terms of the actual storytelling and just hearing Afeni Shakur talk about the legacy of her son, I think that she talked about it in a way, because the other thing that I should have mentioned is that one thing that you learn about being in radio is that when you're interviewing people, it makes for a much more intimate setting. People can be very intimidated. When you think about your average setup for broadcast, cameras, makeup everywhere, bright lights, people are very nervous. And it takes a while. Sometimes it takes, a good 5 minutes to really get to the meat of the interview, because they're stumbling and they're not comfortable. I've noticed at the time it takes an interview subject to get comfortable in radio is a lot less. It's a much more intimate setting. You're there in front of a mic. Sometimes you're in there with the person you're interviewing, and sometimes they're in a different location, but it's a much more intimate setting. So I think that sometimes you get more out of them. And I think that definitely that was the case with Afeni Shakur. We didn't have all of those distractions. She joined us by phone, and so she was very comfortable, opening up in a way that I'm not so sure she would have if we had a camera and a bunch of people, kind of poking at her beforehand, and then, like I said, the camera and the lights and everything on her. So I think it definitely more intimate. I think we definitely got more out of the interview that way. Does that answer your?
Can you talk a little bit about advertising in radio? Where that's going, if there's an increased desire to put advertisements on the radio, and where you're sort of going with that? Because right now I don't see many advertisements on the radio, so I was wondering if there was an imminent shift, or.
Well, I think that NPR is kind of different because it's not commercial radio. So most of what we, like our interstitials, the things that go before, either between our pieces, are really funders, people who fund, our show. So I'm not sure on the commercial end how that works, because I've not worked for commercial radio.
On the other hand, there are people who are criticizing public radio for taking more and more underwriters that sound like commercials, and there are a lot of purists who are quite upset that said this program is underwritten by, and then they do this long thing about how great this company is. And that goes over the line for a lot of purists
Like Walmart,
at public radio who think there should be no commercial. Yeah, like Walmart. big controversy over that. So, but you're never going to hear something that sounds like a commercial on commercial radio, which you hear at KNX. But slowly, because they need money, you know, there are little areas where you can slip it in.
Good question. Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about the decision to switch from Bitcoin to Fry?
What about it specifically?
Just, you know, whether, just, you know, why you chose Fry, I guess.
Why we chose Fry?
Yeah.
Well, I think to begin with, it was quite a challenge working when our staff was part of our staff. We had about three or four members of our staff in New York City, and that posed quite a bit of a challenge, just in terms of trying to get, you know, a daily show on the air. And so I think the choice of Farai was just a natural progression of things. I mean, she'd been filling in her title before host was co-host correspondent. So she was filling in on the show quite a bit, and you know, it just seemed like the very natural thing to do. And given, you know, where we're headed with the show, the big multimedia component, I mean, Farai has definitely proven to be well versed in that, and has quite an impressive resume, and has done a wonderful job. We've always gotten wonderful feedback from stations about when she had hosted in the past. And so it just seemed like a very natural thing to do, and everybody. I mean, we were just in the encouraging thing. We were just in Philadelphia for a radio conference last week, and all the stations were really excited about Farai. You know, so we're definitely excited too.
Yeah, Dean.
Can you think of a story that your main listeners, the core audience, is really interested in, that maybe the mainstream media, for lack of a better word, ignored or underplayed, and that became an opportunity for you?
You mean a mainstream story that we took a...
Well, what I'm thinking of is something that's missing from mainstream news that your audience really is interested in. Are there some stories that stand out that you think were either underreported or not reported at all, that were kind of ignored by the mainstream media?
When I think about the stories, I mean, there are a couple that come to mind. One, and I think probably the strongest pieces that we've done, it was actually a 2-day series, where Farai went down to Skid Row with a producer and reported on what was going on down there. And it was something that, you know, made national news, but I think the power of Farai actually going down there, and she followed 2 LAPD officers on their journey, and not only looked at, okay, from a law enforcement perspective, what are the challenges of, you know, the Skid Row beat, but also she took it a step further and said, okay, who are these folks down here on Skid Row? And, you know, one of the most powerful exchanges in that piece was between somebody who works down there. I believe she was a social worker, and she ran into one of her clients. And about, I guess, a month or so before, she was trying to get some help and some services for this woman who had an infant. And in the process, they discovered drugs in her home, so they took her child away. And she had not seen the social worker since this happened. And Farai was with them when they ran into, when the social worker and the individual kind of collided, and she cursed her out. And it was something that, you know, we aired a part of that. And what you could hear in that woman's voice was betrayal. Like, you were supposed to help me, and I lost my child because of you. And I think that Farai was really right. That was her. Yeah, that was her. That's how she felt, though. And you could hear that, and you could hear the pain. And Farai actually talked to the social worker afterwards about that, and about how, to the best of her ability, she was trying to help this woman. And you know, she was in tears after the woman cursed her out, because it was hard and it was a struggle. And I think that, you know, we were able to really show all different sides of that. We were able to show the law enforcement. We were able to show who's living down there. We were able to show, you know, give you a bit of insight in terms of who's working with this population. And I think that it was a very, you know, it was a very powerful series. And I think the other story that I mentioned earlier, when we did Black Muslims, was another example, because at the time, and I think it was about, I'm trying to remember when we did the story, it was probably about a year ago, and there was a lot of talk. It was around the time when there was just a lot of talk in general about, how are we portraying Islam? Is it kind of the religion of terror? And so this was a way for us to, because when I was thinking about it, I was like, well, there's a lot of, let's just talk about first, just who are these black Muslims? And we hear about, the number of black men in particular who convert to Islam in prisons. What's that about? And so we really, took a whole segment and said, let's dissect this. And how do black Muslims feel about this, perceived, real or perceived attack on their religion? And so I think that's a better example of how, something that was kind of in the national media, how we were able to kind of take that and say, okay, let's take a closer look about it. And I always try to, when we're in editorial meetings and when I'm, kind of culling through the papers and deciding what we should report on, I always try to look at it in terms of, okay, the friends that I have that are African American, when they're listening to, when they're watching the news, what can I hear them saying? What can I hear my grandmother saying? And a lot of times it's, well, I want to know what Jesse Jackson is doing about this. Does he want to go to, is he considering flying to the Mideast? Is he, so I try to think kind of outside of myself, because I know that because I'm in this business, because of my job, I am reading the newspapers. I am, constantly taking all of this in. But I try to separate that. So what are people curious about? What would they want to know, particularly African Americans, since that's our intended, audience for the most part.
You were in New York. We just had the 5th anniversary of 9/11. You were in New York working in news business, and 9/11 happened. Can you tell us what happened those days?
Yeah, I was. And I remember very clearly I had just woken up, and I was listening to the radio, and they mentioned that a plane had gone into the World Trade Center, and I thought, no. And I turned on Good Morning America, just as the second plane hit, and I remembered thinking, okay, I have to get into the office because this isn't just an accident. And I remember I was living in Harlem at the time, and I remember getting on the bus, and I could see the flames coming out of the towers, and so I rushed in, adrenaline flowing. My first instinct was to just go down there because I really wanted to cover it, but I knew that I had to head in the bureau first to kind of await my assignment. And it was definitely the first probably 3 hours were very chaotic because we were trying to kind of wrap our minds around, okay, what happened? How did this happen? So it was a mixture of trying to figure out, okay, what do we know? And at the time, we were hearing all kinds of reports that there are, 10 more unaccounted planes in the air, and that number was constantly changing. What can we filter to Peter to go on the air with? And so a lot of it was just culling through all the different reports that we were getting. And at the same time, obviously, there was stuff going on in D.C. And, we have our, what do they call them, squawk boxes, I guess. Yeah. Where, different reporters are calling in. And I remember it was very terrifying to hear, Martha Raddatz at the Pentagon calling in, as she's trying to evacuate from the Pentagon, and hearing someone who, I know and who we always hear. I mean, Martha Raddatz is one of the most composed individuals, and she was afraid for her life because she was trying to report what was going on and saying, we're evacuating, and she's cursing and carrying on because she's frightened because a plane just went into the Pentagon. And so it was definitely very trying because we're trying, it was one of those moments where it was very difficult to separate, okay, I'm a journalist, but I'm also a person. And, as you're going through the information, making sure your relatives and loved ones know that you're okay and worrying about them. And so it was definitely specifically because I was there in New York, it was a challenge. And just getting together.
What amazed me about that, I was in Colorado, and my daughter called and said, turn on the television, and that's right as the second plane.
Oh, wow.
And I called into the bureau, you could hear the screaming of people. This is L.A.,
right?
As you can imagine. It isn't just New York.
Right.
The adrenaline rush was, what are we all doing?
Right.
And the fact that anybody even had, I said, where do you want me? I mean, that's what you just say, where do you want me? And they said, all the anti-terrorism experts are at a conference in Salt Lake City, and they've grounded all the planes, so they're all stuck there. 6-hour drive. I just got in my car and headed to Salt Lake, listening to the radio, listening to NPR all through the desert, and listening to it live. getting there, of course, these terrorism experts had shut the doors. They weren't letting in reporters to talk about the scenarios. I just said, what are some of the worst scenarios besides the one we just saw? And they said, oh, you don't want to know. You know, so it was like I was there for 6 days because there were no planes, and people were offering to buy my car to get home from trying to drive back home in the east. They couldn't get anywhere. Anyway, what impressed me about that was how in the middle of all that, people had the presence of mind to know where to send people out in the hinterlands, even though we weren't at ground zero and covering it. It was pretty amazing effort. I was impressed with all of the news, most of the newscasts that day.
And it's definitely an overwhelming experience because, as I said, you obviously can't completely separate your personal emotions and your personal fears, but at the same time you have to get stuff on the air, and that has to be a priority. And it's difficult too because so much information, as I said, is coming in from all over the place. You have reporters, you have both producers and correspondents all over not just country, all over the world, saying, well, I just heard this and I just heard that, and you were getting all these reports. Okay, how we got to get law enforcement, we got to get a source on the phone to try to confirm or not, to see what we can then filter to Peter. Then you're dealing with, in TV, obviously, you're dealing with the video, getting that video in, getting it logged, because Peter was on the air nonstop, making sure that you're getting video of what's going on in Ground Zero, what's going on at the Pentagon, what's going on, and as the story progresses, your net, in a way, gets a little bit wider in that then it goes to kind of, the missing, and making sure that you have correspondents down there to cover that, to get a feel of what's going on, what's the mood in New York, getting that color. And it was definitely a challenge. I mean, I remember being there that first night, till, I don't know, I think I worked a full day just in there. And it is difficult because you're seeing, unlike the people at home, you're seeing some of the same images over and over and over again, and it's really and then you go, I remember one time Heron, who I know you know very well, she and I said, okay, we need a break, let's just go walk around the block, because that's really all we had time to do. But you go out and you have that scent of, you can smell Ground Zero from where you are, and we walked into the building still, and it's a scent that I, to this day, can't even describe to you. And so it's like you're trying to escape, but you can't really. And, we were seeing, we had quite a few folks come in, amateur video folks coming in with the video that they took from down there, and so we'd have to sit in a room with them and cull through. So we saw a lot of the video and had to see a lot of the video over and over again that didn't make it because it was people jumping out of buildings, what happens when they land, just very difficult images that we were seeing over and over again. And that's one of the more difficult things about being a journalist, but it also, in a kind of weird way, reminds you of why you're there. It reminds you, it really is this gruesome. I'm here to tell this story. I mean, obviously in a way that's respectful to the dead, respectful to those who are struggling, but it definitely was a reminder of, okay, this is why I'm here. Because I think that the greater sense that I got from reporting on the story and from talking to people is that, I got more phone calls. What's going on? What's the latest? People wanted to know what they could do. And I felt fortunate enough. That was my service. My service was to, as a disseminator of that information, and I was part of that, outgoing product, part of what people saw, when they wanted to know what was going on at ABC, in New York. Sorry.
It's interesting with all the flapdoodle about Katie Curry taking over and was she up to it. The real test of any anchor is a moment like that.
Oh, definitely.
And I thought it was Peter Jennings' finest hour.
Oh, definitely.
Nobody does it better.
Definitely.
And let's see who else. There are a lot of people who were good that day. But that's where the test is, not sitting there reading a teleprompter every night. It's how well do you go to different, how well do you stay calm. And you can't imagine the stuff that's being said in your ear and thrown at you. So
sure.
It's a real test.
It's very true. I mean, he was a master at, when he was live and covering a breaking news story, as Judy said, with a million voices in his ear, and sometimes he would say, okay, we need to get this clear, what we think might be, but we need to check. And he would even say, guys, can we check on this? And he was just very good at it in those situations. And the interesting thing about that time is that we went from coverage of 9/11 to anthrax. And we had anthrax it wasn't even a month later, it was about early October.
Still not solved, right?
Still not solved. Still not solved. Still not solved. And one of the ABC News producers, it was her son who got it. And so our floor was completely, I just remember, all of a sudden after the broadcast, our executive producer, who was at the time Paul Slavin, said, okay, everybody gather around. And next thing we know, in walks Giuliani. And I said, uh-oh, must be, anthrax. And sure enough, it was. And so that created another kind of, it was interesting because in that respect, we became a story in and of itself. We were on CNN and we were on, Fox and all those other channels, and we had to evacuate because it was the World News Tonight area, specifically the World News Tonight floor that they thought was contaminated. So we had to work out of a completely different building, which was difficult because we were still covering so much with 9/11. So it was definitely a challenge. Much better. Nice weather.
Anybody have a last question? Yeah. We'll have you the grand finale here.
Just going back to the business side of it, and there's been talk about how there are more jobs in publicly, and that's where the growth is. Would you mind just kind of explaining that? And is that because there just used to be so few jobs, or is it really a huge explosion? What does that mean?
Well, I don't have the exact numbers, but I think that it's very simple. I think that when you look at, and first I'm going to use kind of the TV news model, and then I'll make my way back to radio. When you look at what's going on in TV news, and when you look at the fact that they are cutting down in terms of budget and not growing, and what that means, especially when you're looking at, we're now in a time where technology really has facilitated not having to send people out, or not having to send as many people out to cover a story. If you're gathering video from pool feeds and all these other different sources, what you really, there were times, especially more frequently as I was getting ready to leave ABC, where you'd have a New York-based correspondent completely doing a whole story that was based out of Colorado or somewhere else, because they were getting all the video fed in, all the local video from local TV news affiliates, or they would hire a freelance camera crew to go out and shoot stuff. The New York-based correspondent was able to do interviews from the New York studio with whatever experts they needed, and putting it all together there. And so slowly, as TV news, if their budgets are shrinking, that means they're using less people. Now producers are being trained. I know how to do Avid. When I was leaving ABC, I was cutting stuff for air, cutting voiceovers. So that means that I'm now serving as a producer and an editor. So why do we need that extra editor? So that's a loss of a job. You know what I mean? So I think that the further on you get, the fewer people it'll take. And I think that the way that ABC was talking about was that is the future, that you can't just be an editor or a producer, that you have to be able to do both, that you have to be able to, in addition to gathering all the elements for your story, cut your own story. Whereas that used to be more of a collaborative process where it would be yourself, a correspondent, and an editor, a 3-person thing. Now they're saying maybe we just need 2 people to do it. And I think that a lot of that is financial. They're able to realize, hey, we can cut corners here. A lot of it is technology driven. Hey, if we have the technology to do it, if we can even teach producers, because some of the producers were learning how to shoot on the DV cams. If we can send a producer out with the correspondent to shoot, then hey, that gets rid of a cameraman. And if that producer can then shoot it themselves, along with the correspondent, come back and edit it themselves, hey, that's saving us loads of money. And I think the difference in public radio is that because it is growing, you do have a little bit more, I think you're less likely to say, okay, let's have one person do it all. And you are able to look at it in terms of, you're able to look at technology as, how should we be thinking more creatively? How can we be really at the forefront of, furthering what we're doing, creating more, as I said before, kind of more cross-promotional. How do we integrate online content with, what you hear on the radio? So I think that, does that answer your question?
Before we thank Nicole, remember to come here on Michelle Tuesday and Mark Brown 2 weeks from today in this room, KABC TV News. And Nicole, really, thank you so much for coming. It's such a short